All right, so we have a new poll out in the Ed Markey versus Joe Kennedy matchup in the state of Massachusetts. So this new poll out does show Ed Markey edging ahead of Joe Kennedy. This is good news because we saw last time around the last poll out did show Joe Kennedy ahead of Ed Markey. Now it does look like Ed Markey is pulling ahead a little bit, but still it's pretty close, and I'm a little worried. What do you think?
Yeah, it looks like it's relatively close, and there's still a decent amount of time left before although people are, I guess, starting to send in mail ballots now, or in the next few days, there was expanded voting. So people could be voting now, but there's still plenty of time for stuff to happen. So hopefully it's enough, that we've seen there's been
Right.
endorsements from Indivisible, Planned Parenthood, teacher
Yep.
unions, peace groups, environmental activists. So these are all good things. So hopefully they can keep things moving along for him.
Right. We're starting to see a lot of endorsements come in for Ed Markey over Joe Kennedy. We just saw the Boston Globe endorsement, which is a really big endorsement. I'm going to be getting to a question about that in just a second in the actual poll, but that is a pretty big endorsement given that is the largest newspaper in the state. And so, it does have the possibility of switching up things a little bit, pushing things a little bit. Although, as we're going to see in the particular poll, voters claim that it's going to have no effect. But let's go through this particular poll, take a look at some of the questions being asked, and see if there's anything interesting here. So, the first question there, obviously, question one: if the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate were held today, which candidate would you support? You can see there Ed Markey, edging out Joe Kennedy just a little bit with 4 percentage points there at 40 versus 36. Now, obviously, you can see there, Chris, the big question mark is that 24% undecided. Now, this is unsurprising that it's a massive 24% undecided. However, I want to make one point here, which maybe you'll disagree with me. So let me know or whatever. But it's possible. It's possible that given the mail-in ballot thing, the undecided voters. The question is, who are they going to break for? And the question of who they're leaning towards may have a little bit more import than in a typical election.
Yeah, I mean, it could make a big difference. That 24% is obviously a very large number. So even if that undecided vote is relatively close, it still could make a big difference in Markey versus Kennedy. And now I assume they're taking the same route that was done in Kentucky, where those by convincing voters to get those ballots in early could be the factor that affects things down the road. So hopefully Markey is kind of taking that same cue and saying, let's really get people to get those ballots in the mail now or whenever they open the polls.
Right.
Let's get those ballots in so they can't change their mind down the
Right.
road.
Well, it is a little bit of a weird situation in this particular race because usually that's going to be the strategy for incumbents, right? For incumbents, you want to get voters to vote early so that then they have, the fewest sort of information about the challenging candidate as possible, right? Because that's going to edge in their favor. That's the general strategy that you're going to want to run for incumbents when you're trying to get mail-in ballots in. The question though is we did see earlier polls earlier in this cycle showing Joe Kennedy edging it out. Now, obviously that's because he's a Kennedy. Now, let's take a look. You were specifically claiming there, we were both claiming there about the way in which voters who are leaning or undecided how they're leaning. So question two, only if they were being asked only to people who are undecided. Given that you are undecided, which candidate are you leaning towards supporting? You can see there Ed Markey at 44%, Joe Kennedy at 41%, and then still we have another 16% at undecided. Now that's 16% of 24%. So at that point, we are talking about a pretty small,
Yeah.
small percentage point there, most likely less than like 5% of the overall electorate. Now you can see there, it's still pretty close though. Again, 44 to 41. So that's really a 3-point lead. That said, compounded on top of on top of an already 4-point lead, it really is though still going to come down to, if it is about 4 to 5% there, it is going to come down to that 16% that is finally undecided. So that's
Right.
kind of that's the scary part maybe because it's still close, but it's, maybe this is good news, maybe it's bad news. We'll have to see more polls, right?
Yeah. And it's going to be a little harder to measure that question number two because you're talking about a small group because you're picking just from the people who said they're undecided. So that margin of error in that question at least could be bigger than the difference in between them, right? So it could be that
Mm.
it's essentially a toss up at this point.
Right, but that said, again, the earlier polls were leaning towards Joe Kennedy, so you have to
Right.
think, well, maybe this is an early indication that the winds have changed. We just saw that recent debate between Joe Kennedy and Ed Markey, and a lot of clips were going around showing Ed Markey absolutely obliterating Joe Kennedy, showing Joe Kennedy, fumbling around, not really knowing what he was talking about, pivoting to, claims about. Actually, I have the clip right here, pivoting to how we need to pick up the House and win the Senate or whatever. Let me just play that clip for you all so you can see it right here. Let's watch this. Watch this together here.
Has worked very hard for his constituents. But let's be clear, the reason why we've been able to deliver more for our communities is because we have Democrats in control of the House of Representatives.
So, I mean, you can just see there Joe Kennedy basically pivoting to how it's important to pick up House seats, to pick up the Senate, when you're in the middle of a primary run between two Democrats there. He's clearly just saying that line to get applause because he lost his train of thought. He doesn't really know where he's going, and he doesn't have a real solid criticism against Ed Markey, because that was the question. What's a criticism of Ed Markey? He comes up with nonsense. He just tries to go for an applause line because he doesn't have anything. He doesn't have anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have to be able to answer those kinds of basic questions. You think, when you're preparing to go into a debate, you figure there's a pretty short list of basic questions are going to be thrown at you, and you should be able to answer those. Like, he's pretty soft on the question in general of why are you running for this position? It doesn't seem like there's a real good answer.
Right.
People don't really understand exactly why if he can't come out and say why he's running, it's pretty hard to get behind that and say, oh yeah, I really believe in this message that he's putting out there.
Well, Chris, the other big reason that he's saying that we need to get rid of Ed Markey is actually in this article here from Politico here. Kennedy unloads on the Boston Globe over endorsement snub. That's a bit of a weirdly phrased headline. Basically, the Boston Globe decided to endorse Ed Markey over Joe Kennedy, and so he responded by saying, as you can see here, ripping the state's largest newspaper, and he ultimately described here saying, quote, if you are one of the Globe's disproportionately white, well-off, well-educated readers, the past few decades have been pretty good for you. The status quo has delivered. Ed Markey has done just fine. This is one of those annoying things that, really gets to me. It's this idea that, well, because you're in elected office, it automatically means that you're an establishment person. Now, look, I'm not saying that Ed Markey is perfect. I think that even, maybe especially some of the stuff that he did when he was first in office, maybe are a little bit more questionable. But over the past couple years, he's really done a lot of good work for progressives. He introduced the Green New Deal into the Senate, with AOC introducing it into the House. So that's some really good stuff. And he's also done a lot of other really good stuff, fighting for Bernie Sanders, fighting with AOC. So, this is for Joe Kennedy to come out and make claims like this, like, oh, Ed Markey's just a part of the establishment, is again one of those talking points that you hear, and you oftentimes hear it from Republicans, that, oh, government is the problem, that being in government is the thing that makes you corrupt. It's why they want to talk about term limits, right? It's because this idea that, well, if once you go to Washington, you immediately get into the swamp and you get corrupted. Now, certainly there's some truth to that, and there's a lot of sort of pressure in there. But you also need to ask the question, why is it the case that now Ed Markey is coming out and fighting for progressive values? Maybe it means that he's doing things right. And by the way, guys, if you're getting skeptical and thinking to yourself, well, maybe he is corrupt because he's been there so long. Well, Joe Kennedy's been there in the House, just in the House a lot less. And some of the things that he's been on has been a lot worse.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a real roll of the dice if you're going to go after an endorsement that didn't go your way. If you're going to try to do that, you really got to have a message that is going to resonate with people, because otherwise it can really end up looking like just kind of sour grapes and whining about how, things really didn't go your way. So, and this is a case where it seems like his excuse is kind of falling flat, and in my opinion, doesn't make him look better, probably the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, those remarks are definitely pretty questionable. I'm sure some people are going to look at that and think to themselves, well, I mean, come on, that you just got you didn't get the endorsement and now you're turning around and whining about it. But that is the kind of thing that campaigns do. It's the kind of thing that campaigns are, that they'll say, try to say, oh, well, I didn't even want the endorsement over anyway, which is, great great uses of the sour grape there, Aesop's
Right.
fable. Well, I didn't get it. I never wanted it anyway, right? So let's take a look here at a few of the other questions here. Question 3, Senator Ed Markey has served in Congress for 44 years. Would his 44-year length of service make you more or less likely to vote for him? So this is actually pretty positive news for Ed Markey here. I mean, you can't really ask for much more. That 30% makes it more likely, and then 30% makes it less likely, and 40% saying that it makes no difference, essentially saying that it's a wash. And that, I think, does go to what we were just talking about with Joe Kennedy, which is that Joe Kennedy, again, his really only line of criticism of Ed Markey is trying to, A, link him to the establishment, and then B, say, well, the establishment isn't working for you, as you saw there, sort of, alluded to or whatnot in that quote that we just saw there, and trying to make that kind of criticism. And the fact that the poll numbers are coming up this way suggests that maybe Joe Kennedy's general meta strategy, or the general strategy he's trying to aim at, isn't going to have the particular effect that he wants it to have with the voters. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, it seems like this is one, if you just look how those numbers came out, I mean, 30, 30, 40 for more likely, less likely, it makes no difference. It seems like people don't really care that much about,
right.
This strikes me as a question that was answered by a bunch of people that probably didn't care, and they just kind of threw out some answers.
Exactly.
Which is how I would be if I was answering this question. I'm not really too concerned about how long you have been there, more concerned about what you have done while you have been there, who have you represented, what things have you done. Is a much more meaningful question than okay, so he's been there for 44 years.
Exactly. That's my view as well, and it is why I don't ultimately support the idea of term limits. I mean, there are some government posts where that makes sense, but for the post of Congress, for the post of Senate, I don't necessarily support it. This idea that, well, because you are in Congress for a long period of time, it automatically means that you're corrupted. Not necessarily. I mean, you can probably run a statistical correlation and find out that you're more likely to get corrupted the longer you're there. No doubt there. But again, it becomes a question of causation, right? It becomes a question of, well, why is that the case? Is it the case that you were corrupted so you were able to stay longer in Congress? I don't know. I maybe lean a little bit more towards that solution. Okay, so question 4 there. Would you be more or less likely to vote for a candidate who has the name Kennedy? Now, I'm going to be honest with this question here, Chris. I don't know that the voters really know their own motivations here. You can see here 20% saying more likely, 24% saying less likely, and then 57% saying it makes no difference. Guys, the only reason why Joe Kennedy is even making a credible run against Ed Markey is because he is a Kennedy. So I'll be honest, I don't know that I believe the voters here. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I kind of have the same criticism as I did for the last question, which is the way those numbers fall. It strikes me as people who were asked a question that they probably didn't feel too strongly about either way. I agree. Kennedy's probably in there because of his name recognition. And, it seems like in the long run, people don't like these family dynasties. We heard that with the Clinton name, when Clinton was running a few years ago, that, people are generally against creating these dynasties, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Kennedys, where people end up getting recognized because they are part of a family.
Well,
right?
but
and that gives them this big boost.
Well, for sure. But I mean, Chris, this is also a situation where Kennedy is popular. I mean, Kennedy doesn't have the same kind of dynasty criticism that like the Clintons had, for instance. I mean, Kennedy is maybe a little bit of a more popular dynasty, if there is one, over the Clinton dynasty and especially the Bush dynasty as well. And again, there is that sort of infrastructure there with the Kennedy dynasty that might not exist for the Clinton dynasty there. I mean, you look at a situation right now where, again, the only reason why Joe Kennedy is even able to make this run as early as he is with as little experience as he has in the House is because of the fact that his name is Kennedy. He has all the right connections. He grew up, meeting all the right people in order to do something like this.
Yeah, and whether it's a good dynasty or bad dynasty, I personally try to stay away from, I might pay attention to someone because they're from a certain family, but you're still going to have to earn that vote. You're still going to have to show me that you're standing on some actual substance.
Yeah, no, that's my view as well. I was just saying that like the
Yeah.
popular, like the name Kennedy is a little bit
Right.
more popular in the, if you took a poll over like, who do you, which name is more appealing to you, Clinton or Kennedy? I'm
Yeah.
pretty
Right.
sure that Kennedy is going to come up more popular than Clinton.
Right.
Pretty sure about that one. So question 5 here, last question that we're going to look at today. The Boston Globe recently endorsed Ed Markey, as we mentioned earlier, in the Democratic Senate primary. How do you think that their endorsement will affect your vote? More likely to support Markey, 19%, more likely to support Kennedy, 14%, and makes no difference, 67%. I think, again, Chris, this is probably a question where a lot of voters didn't really care and then just sort of said something. I think, am I right to think that maybe?
It seems like you're pretty even there, 19 to 14%, and then you've got the vast majority, over 2/3 of people saying it doesn't really make any difference. And
Right. And I imagine that, like, if you're a strong Kennedy supporter or a strong Markey supporter, you're probably just going to say, oh, well, it makes me more likely to support Kennedy. It makes me more likely
right,
to support Markey. Right. So that's
right,
probably what we're seeing in those percentages as well. Like, yeah, right. Like, if a strong Kennedy supporter gets told
right.
that the Boston Globe endorsed the other side, you're like, wow, you have that kind of like reaction to it. So I think that that's what some of what's going on there. Nonetheless, though, overall, I think if we're looking at this poll from a sort of eagle eye view, from a bird's eye view here, it does look like this is good for Ed Markey. It's good for Ed Markey. That said, it's way too close to take comfort. Way, way, way too close to take comfort. If you don't know Joe Kennedy, just look him up and you will immediately not like him. So I'll just leave it at that. Chris, any final thoughts here?
No, I mean, being a West Coast guy, I'm not super familiar with the Boston Globe and their history of endorsements and exactly how things go. So,
Well, yeah, well, I was just going to say, so the Boston Globe usually waits to endorse until quite a bit closer into the race. But this time, because of the mail-in ballot situation, they're endorsing earlier. So there is a question there whether or not this endorsement is going to weigh in more heavily than usually, or whether or not it's just going to end up not mattering at all because voters will have forgotten about it. So,
right.
it's one of those where we don't know, but it quite possibly is going to have an effect, but we don't know which way the effect is going to go. So it's interesting. It's interesting. We'll have to be following this race. Guys, go check out Chris's channel. And also, we're going to have a link for 2 things down in the description to this video. We're going to have a link down in the description for Chris's channel, and we're going to have a link down in the description to go support Ed Markey. If you haven't heard it from the tone of my voice, I don't want Joe Kennedy to take out Ed Markey. So we're going to have links for both of those things down in the description. So go down in the description, check out both of those things. If you have the means, if you are able to, at least consider supporting Ed Markey. Joe Kennedy, guys, we can't have that. We can't have that. All right, we'll see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.